Bridgewater went down with a non-contact injury to his left knee. Bridgewater immediately had his knee put into an air cast, left via ambulance.
His knee folded inside, and there were guys at practice who were throwing up. There were guys who were crying.
With a knee dislocation, 60 to 70% of the time you end up with a relatively normal knee afterwards. 40% of the time you may not.
Minnesota traded for Sam Bradford and gave Philly a first-round pick and a conditional fourth-rounder. Now,
Teddy Bridgewater going to miss next season as well.
In 2016, Teddy Bridgewater was just about to go into his third season and had just come off an 11-5 season with a Pro Bowl appearance. However, this all changed on August 30th, where he had a brutal injury in practice, where he tore his ACL and dislocated his knee, and in today's video I will show you just how it impacted the entire NFL. From 2011 to 2013, Teddy Bridgewater was the star quarterback at the University of Louisville. He in fact even won the Sugar Bowl there in a huge upset over the Florida Gators. He was then drafted with the 32nd overall pick to the Minnesota Vikings. In 2014, he played about half of the season and showed just enough promise to get by. This was back 10 years ago, where rookie quarterbacks didn't put up amazing numbers, so him throwing for 14 touchdowns and 12 interceptions was more of the norm in 2014 as compared to today, where you see CJ Stroud just lighting up the field. So yes, the stats aren't that great, but it was more in line with the times back then. Then in 2015, he had his big breakout year. The Vikings ended up going 11-5. Now, Teddy Bridgewater's stats, specifically his touchdowns, are not that impressive once again, but there is more to look at. This was in one of the years where the Vikings actually played outside because their dome collapsed. So, in the freezing cold of Minnesota, they did run the ball a lot. Not to mention, they still had an Adrian Peterson, who was still one of the best running backs in the NFL. He was actually first team All-Pro in the NFL, so the best running back in the NFL. That really explains away the whole Teddy Bridgewater only throwing for 14 touchdowns when you have Adrian Peterson rushing for 1,500 yards in the season. So it makes sense that Teddy was more of a game manager. Then in the playoffs versus the Seattle Seahawks, it was one of the coldest games in NFL history.
The temperature is -6. It only feels like it's -25.
And it was a crazy game in which the Vikings lost 10-9. And even worse, if you can remember, Blair Walsh, the Vikings kicker, missed a 27-yard field goal with 26 seconds remaining.
McDermott is the snapper, and the kick is no good!
It may take a lot to get me mad, but this did it.
So Teddy Bridgewater had really done enough to win this game. It was just some classic Vikings magic to pull out a loss. This brings us to the season of 2016. Many experts around the league saw the Minnesota Vikings as a dark horse Super Bowl team. They had talent all over the field on offense and especially on defense. However, this all changed on August 30th, in which Teddy Bridgewater suffered a career-threatening injury and even a leg-threatening injury, because there was a decent chance that he would have had to have his leg amputated if things didn't go right.
We know that even with the best care, he has a 20% chance of having a terrible knee for the rest of his life.
Thankfully, he had the best medical care, and he was able to save his leg and even play in the NFL for several more years. However, he lost a lot of athleticism and could not return to his former ability. In response to this, the Vikings thought, we have a great team, we are in a Super Bowl window, we need to do something. This is where the Philadelphia Eagles come in. They had just drafted Carson Wentz with the number 2 overall pick. Sam Bradford had just come off a season in which he was decent, he was okay. He threw for almost 4,000 yards and 20 touchdowns. Okay quarterback. And the original plan for 2016 was to have Sam Bradford start for most of the year and eventually towards the end, have Carson Wentz take over kind of a trial run of a season and really start playing the following season in 2017. However, Howie Roseman loves to make a good deal. So when he heard the Vikings needed a starting quarterback, he picked up the phone right away and made a call. The Vikings ended up trading their first round pick the next year and their fourth round pick the following year for Sam Bradford. This was a great trade for the Eagles and really set them up for years to come. This was a quarterback that they really kind of wanted to get rid of, and they got amazing value for him. On the Vikings side of the ball, they did get a starting caliber quarterback and potentially saved their Super Bowl window. Because not only did they think Teddy Bridgewater was out for the year, but of course they thought he may never come back. So they needed an answer somewhere. So it did make sense on both sides. However, in 2016, it did not work out the way the Vikings wanted. They were off to a really hot start the first 5 weeks of the season, and they went 5-0. However, then they had their bye week in week 6, and their season fell apart after that. In the second half of the year, it really fell apart on each side. Adrian Peterson was not playing very well anymore. Sam Bradford was average, and he was not enough to make a difference. They started the season averaging about 25 points per game, and they fell down to about 15 points per game the remainder of the season. And they started allowing about 18 points per game, and over the rest of the season averaged about 22 points per game. So on offense and on defense, they just kind of fell apart, and they went from 5-0 to ending 8-8.
Playoffs? Don't talk about it. Playoffs? You kidding me? I just hope we can win a game.
This does multiple things. Not only does it make it so that, of course, their Super Bowl window shrunk or has disappeared before they knew it, but also that first round pick is a lot more valuable than they thought it was.
I apologize for that. That's the best we can do. That's a sad problem.
Please consider liking and subscribing. I am really trying to grow this channel, but back to the video. Over in Philadelphia, their season went probably about as they would have expected, or maybe even a little better. Carson Wentz had a lot of ups and downs, as you would expect with a rookie quarterback from North Dakota. But he showed enough athleticism and promise for the Eagles to really believe in the next season and to believe that they have a very bright future ahead of them. They ended up going 7-9 and even won the last 2 games of the season. Going into 2017 is really where the impact of the Teddy Bridgewater trade is felt around the league. Starting off with the Minnesota Vikings, of course. So they had another strong team. Their defense actually allowed the least amount of points per game in the NFL. They had a good run defense and a good pass defense. It's a very solid team, and their offense actually had a spark. Now, it was not from Sam Bradford, because Sam Bradford unfortunately got hurt for the season, and this isn't that much of a surprise for Sam Bradford because he was very fragile and very injury prone. So Teddy Bridgewater had not yet recovered. The Vikings then had Case Keenem step up.
I have to admit, I didn't see this coming.
Case Keenem started 14 games and went 11-3, 22 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. It was really a remarkable season for Case Keenem. No one believed in him that much going forward, but for this season, he was excellent. They no longer had Adrian Peterson, but they had a stable of solid running backs such as Latavius Murray, Jerick McKinnon, and Dalvin Cook, even though Dalvin Cook wasn't that good yet, but he was part of the stable. However, the receiving weapons were elite. They had Adam Thielen, who was in the Pro Bowl and was just starting to show his promise and his skill. They had Kyle Rudolph, the tight end, who was also very good. And then they had Stephon Diggs, showing that he can be an elite wide receiver. The solid offense and defense for the 2017 Minnesota Vikings led them to go to a 13-3 record, and the Vikings ranked second in the NFC. This was back in 2017 when the second place also got a bye, so there wasn't that much of a difference between first and second, other than who gets to play at home if they play each other, which does turn out to matter a lot. The Eagles on the other side of the ball had Carson Wentz explode. Carson Wentz was on pace to be the MVP before he got injured tragically against the Rams. But by all accounts, if he had stayed healthy, he would have been the MVP. It definitely helped his career progress by starting in 2016 because he got all of those jitters out of the way. The Eagles started 10-1 and ended the season 13-3, but with the tiebreaker over the Vikings, so they got the number 1 overall seed. But there are more ways that this trade impacted them. First of all, they were able to use the first round pick of the Minnesota Vikings, which was the 14th overall pick, and with this pick, they picked Derek Barnett, who was seen as a very promising defensive end. A second way that it impacted the Eagles, it also freed up about $18 million in cap space that the Eagles would have had to pay Sam Bradford if he was still on the team. This allowed the Eagles to make a huge signing for Alshon Jeffrey, a great wide receiver from the Bears. Alshon Jeffrey was a physical wide receiver that really completed the offense for the Eagles. But that's not all of the impacts from trading away Sam Bradford for the Eagles. It also left them with a hole in backup quarterback. In 2016, they had signed Chase Daniels, but they didn't quite get from him what they wanted. So in 2017, they had signed a prior quarterback, Nick Foles, who will help them along the way. And of course, this was very important when Carson Wentz tore his ACL and was out for the year on the team that was the number 1 overall seed. The first game of the Vikings playoffs was against the New Orleans Saints in a game now known as the Minniapolis Miracle. Of course, this will be very painful for the Saints fans, but in this fateful day, the Saints had appeared to have beaten the Vikings until a miraculous catch and touchdown run by Stephon Diggs won the Vikings the game. Now this was a disaster for the Saints because this was probably the last time the Saints had the chance to win the Super Bowl.
What?
This was a Saints team that went 11-5, had Drew Brees, who was still an elite quarterback. In fact, he was in the Pro Bowl. Not as good as his prime, but he was still a very solid quarterback, and he even threw for 4,300 yards that season. And they had some elite offensive weapons. They had Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara both make the Pro Bowl. So both of their running backs made the Pro Bowl. And they also had Michael Thomas in his prime, who caught roughly 1,250 yards that season. Their offense was one of the best offenses in the NFL. And their defense was 10th in points allowed. It's a very solid defense, not an elite defense. But this was one of the last chances that Drew Brees would have since he was 38 years old, and he had won the game until he hadn't.
But they are who we thought they were, and we let them off the hook.
There's a good chance if Teddy Bridgewater was still the quarterback, it wouldn't have turned out this way. I could honestly see it going either way. He could have had a better season than Case Keenum, and therefore would have beat the Saints by a decent amount, maybe even been the number 1 overall seed. Or he could have been worse than Case Keenum, and then the Saints would be able to win and would be heading to Philadelphia. So one way or another, the Teddy Bridgewater injury had a huge impact on allowing this matchup to even happen and play out the way it did. Then in the NFC Championship game, the Eagles routed the Vikings. They just blew them out, largely because the Vikings had such an emotional high the week before, and they just came crashing down. They lost 38-7. This was largely due to some genius coaching on the Eagles staff. Their offense had found holes in the Vikings defense, and their defense found tells in the Vikings offense. So it was just a coaching masterclass by the Eagles. However, maybe a more stable quarterback of Teddy Bridgewater would have been able to steady the ship and made it more of a game, and then who knows what happens. Of course, as we know, the Eagles winning this allows them to go on to the Super Bowl and beat Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. But let's rewind a second. If either the Saints played the Eagles with Drew Brees always lighting up the Eagles. It's like every time I've watched him, Drew Brees has dominated the Eagles. So the Saints could have easily have beaten the Eagles. Or on the other side, if Teddy Bridgewater had played and he was a better version of Case Keenum, they could have beat the Eagles. Either way, I believe the Patriots would beat both of those teams. Because the Patriots, they're the Patriots, and it took a miraculous play from Nick Foles, having one of the best Super Bowls ever, to beat them. But this also impacts the Patriots down the line, because this was a game in which Bill Belichick decided not to play Malcolm Butler because who knows why. If you don't know, this was one of their starting corners who mysteriously did not play in the Super Bowl.
I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious.
Now, this caused a bit of a rift, more of a rift that was already forming, but it added to it between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, which eventually leads to Tom Brady leaving the team and joining the Buccaneers and winning a Super Bowl there. But back to 2018, it easily could have went the other way with the Vikings' awesome defense. Could have shut down Tom Brady. It is possible. We saw just the next year against the Rams that you can shut down Tom Brady, or Drew Brees could have pulled some magic out and beaten them. Either way, the Bridgewater injury definitely impacted this Super Bowl, and without it, the Eagles probably aren't winning. In the Eagles Super Bowl, they were up by 5, and then Tom Brady gets the ball with about 2 minutes left, and they are driving down the field before Brandon Graham gets a strip sack, and none other than Derek Barnett, the first-round pick they got from the Vikings, recovers it, which allows the Eagles to kick the field goal, go up by 8, and win the Super Bowl. And you might think the impact stops here, but it actually just keeps on going. The next year, in 2018, the Vikings decide, based off the championship game, that Case Keenum was not the answer for their team, and they spent big money to sign Kirk Cousins. Of course, we know how Kirk Cousins goes. He plays solid, but they just can't win anything. But the other part is that he was so expensive. And if they would have been able to have Teddy Bridgewater, and if he had continued to progress in his career, they could have signed him to a contract that would have been stretched out throughout several years, which would have been much more cap-friendly than the guaranteed contract they gave to Kirk Cousins, with just no flexibility to it. In 2020, after 2 moderately successful seasons for the Vikings, they determined that they needed to trade Stephon Diggs to the Buffalo Bills. In 2019, the Bills had made it to the wildcard game and had lost to the Texans in overtime, and they thought a new wide receiver would really put them over the top, and they were definitely right. They ended up trading a first-round pick and more for Stephon Diggs, who catapulted their offense to the front of the NFL. They were 13-3 in 2020 and ended up making it to the AFC Championship game against the Chiefs. And then, unfortunately, they lost, but they had a huge improvement in their offense. On the other side of the ball, what did the Vikings pick with their first-round pick? They received none other than Justin Jefferson, the best wide receiver in the NFL. If this hadn't happened this way, if things had worked out differently with Teddy Bridgewater, they may have been able to keep Stephon Diggs. Whether it is because they would have had more money to spend on him, or even they could have won the Super Bowl in 2018. And if they win the Super Bowl in 2018, there's no way you trade one of your 2 best offensive players just 2 years later. So there's a very good chance, if Teddy Bridgewater didn't get hurt and progressed through his career, that Diggs would not have been on the Bills. Of course, this means that the Vikings offense probably remains strong, and if this means that Diggs doesn't go to the Bills, this means likely that Justin Jefferson goes to the Bills instead. So instead of the combination of Diggs and Josh Allen, there would have been a combination of Josh Allen and Justin Jefferson. In the first year in 2020, this may not have been enough to make a real change. However, in 2021, it easily could have. And this year they went 11-6, a little bit of a step back. However, they played the Chiefs much closer. This was the game in which they lost to the Chiefs 42-36 in overtime. One of the best games that I've ever seen. But maybe Justin Jefferson would be enough to bring him over the top. And going for years forward, where the Bills have fallen off a little bit, having Justin Jefferson on the team, currently the best wide receiver in the NFL, at least this year, let's say, 2023, they probably could have beaten the Chiefs, who they only lost to by 3 points, and then they could have easily been on their way to the Super Bowl, and the Bills could have a Super Bowl. And if the Bills had won the Super Bowl, had a prime Justin Jefferson and a prime Josh Allen, they could essentially be the team that we see as how we see the Chiefs. They could be the best team in the NFL for years to come. As for what happened to Teddy Bridgewater, he did bounce around the NFL a little bit. He played with the Broncos and he played with the Panthers. However, he was just never the same after the injury. Thankfully, he has recovered for the most part, it seems, but he is now in retirement. But just as a recap, I know this is hypothetical, of course, but the following things could have easily changed if Teddy Bridgewater didn't get hurt. The Minniapolis Miracle could have been no more. This could have easily led to the Eagles not winning their first Super Bowl, and instead either Tom Brady getting one more, maybe ending his career with the Patriots. It could have led to the Vikings winning their first Super Bowl, or it could have led to the Saints winning another one with Drew Brees, solidifying his legacy as a top 10 NFL quarterback in NFL history. And then further on, the Vikings likely could have kept Stephon Diggs, which then means the Bills could have Justin Jefferson and could be a dynasty and taken several Super Bowls away from the Chiefs. So this just shows how one injury to a key player can shape not only one team's future, but the entire NFL's future. So if you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting, and sticking around for more videos. And I'll see you later. Bye.